Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the BIA Knowledge Leadership Series webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Should you wish to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, June 16, 2016. I would now like to turn the conference over to Ms. Robin Thompson. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Nicole. On behalf of the team at BIA, we'd like to welcome you to our June edition of our Knowledge Leadership Series webinar, where our experts will be giving us top tips for handling exiting employee data. Just a very quick reminder to send questions for Adam and Barry through the chat window so that we can address those at the end of the program. And as a bonus for you all, most of you, our regular attendees, know that we plan each of our monthly programs directly from your feedback. As you exit the program today, you'll be prompted to answer a short survey. For those of you who answer the 3 or 4 questions that are there, we will provide you with a checklist and a handout from today's webinar. It is my distinct pleasure to present our speakers today. In addition to his accomplishments listed here, Adam is one of our favorite speakers in our series. He is also a recent New York City Marathon finalist. Also with him today is Barry Schwartz. In addition to Barry's accomplishments here, his most recent accomplishment is that he's had 3 granddaughters in the last year. And with that, I turn the program over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Robin, and welcome everybody to our presentation today. As you can see, our topics are to discuss who or what an exiting employee is, why we should be concerned when employees leave us as employers and companies and so forth. We'll also discuss our best practices for handling the departure of these employees, and we'll provide a series of real-life examples. So first off, one of the things that we suggest is that companies review their policies to determine and confirm that employees' expectations of cooperation and commitment to that cooperation are clearly defined in company policy documents, that the employee has an identified expectation of privacy or lack thereof in the U.S. with respect to business records and so forth, and clearly that the employee acknowledges the receipt of and understanding of those policies. It's up to you in the outset of an employee relationship to define what your expectations are for your employees. And speaking specifically to the expectations of cooperation and the commitments to cooperation, just this week, the Corporate Counsel magazine published an article that discussed the Sally Yates DOJ memo that's entitled Individual Accountability for Corporate Wrongdoing. And what that does is put the onus on corporate employers where there is a government investigation that specifically encourages these companies that are subject to investigations to fully cooperate with the federal government on these investigations. And for doing so, if they are alleged to have committed wrongdoings and found to have committed them, the sanctions and fines and penalties will be mitigated by what is called in the Yates memo a cooperation credit. So if it's not for good practices, still have a clear policy to help mitigate those potential damages and penalties. So what is an exiting employee anyway? Well, first, you don't want to see these kinds of headlines or be a part of a bad situation such as this. So if you don't think preparation is important, it truly is. In this particular article, computer code was allegedly stolen by an employee, sent to his personal email, and also uploaded to a cloud storage solution, and in this instance it happened to be Dropbox. Cases of data leakage and theft they're in the news all the time, and we'll be discussing things to watch out for, steps to take, and things that you should do to protect your firm or your company from the misappropriation of data. So what is an exiting employee anyhow? It's anyone who leaves your organization. It's with or without notice. It could be abruptly or not. You've let them go because you're downsizing or there are performance issues, and the person's status really doesn't matter either. It could be full-time, part-time, a contractor, an intern, a temporary worker. And when the person leaves, you should be aware of any potential red flags, such as they're going to a competitor. Or in the case of business continuity, there's a retirement, and then you need to be mindful of keeping track of that employee's data for the next person in that position. So why the concern? The number one reason to be concerned is to protect sensitive data. That's our opinion, and I think when Adam speaks, he'll talk about some real-life examples and the impacts of loss of data. What you want to be concerned about is formulas and formulations, pricing schedules, the list is here, client lists, sales, marketing strategies, design and engineering documents, your business trade secrets and know-how. How you do things is your business and not anybody else's business except for what you want to share in the public. And so you need to be mindful that all these items and more that are listed here in these bullet points are critical to your business's security and ongoing business prospects. And there are more reasons. You don't want your client's data walking out the door, your processes, your procedures, how you do things. You have legal records and management obligations. With ongoing litigation, there are all sorts of litigation hold requirements, document preservation requirements. You don't want to lose documents. There's a whole body of law regarding what's called spoliation of information, which is the loss of data intentionally or unintentionally. And then there are also regulatory and business records requirements that we won't go into in detail, but as an example, medical device areas, there's a requirement to maintain records for the life of the product and then some. And then, as I said earlier, there's business continuity concerns that you want to be able to educate the next person in line in that position. So which employees do you want to consider as those having access to important or sensitive data? It's really, as I said earlier, everybody in the organization. You have C-level executives, managers, receptionists, scientists, salespeople, financial analysts, board members, production managers, IT staff. It could be anybody. It could be the custodian. And one example that we can share is several years back, a receptionist in a staffing agency took the customer list, the client list for that staffing agency, and pushed it on to her new employer. And obviously what happened is her previous employer's business was hurt rather significantly by the loss of that customer list. Best practices are something we'll discuss now. And at BIA, we have the philosophy that always begin with the end in mind. You don't want data walking out the door or otherwise becoming inaccessible. And in this case, that would be the goal that we would address. Secondly, it's important to assemble a team to provide the overall guidance for the situation. In preparation for litigation, we suggest establishing a legal event team. In this case, it would not necessarily be nearly as formal. However, the key players in your organization need to be aware of what your exiting employee strategies and policies are. That means management, your legal department, IT, HR. All these teams need to be on the same page with respect to what's expected upon the departure of employees from your organization. Thirdly, you need to know what data resources need to be reviewed for potential preservation upon employee termination. And Adam has an extensive list that he'll go through shortly. And then lastly, it's important to develop a process and procedure that we suggest be encompassed in a detailed checklist that is created, that is repeatable, and provides a consistent process no matter who in your organization is performing the exiting process, which would more likely than not include an exit interview as well. So what should we do? In the legal hold scenario, employees can have already exited prior to the issuance of a hold. However, you want to make certain that the employees that are on hold when they leave have their records properly maintained. Secondly, it's important that the electronic assets, that, as I mentioned, be properly maintained, but also be protected, and not only electronic assets, but hard assets such as paper assets, presentations, other storage media, electronic media, thumb drives, and so forth be preserved. And again, not only is it important in the legal hold scenario, but it's also important for business continuity. And there's a recent case that was prosecuted under the Consumer Fraud and Abuse Act in Texas. It was a federal case where an exiting employee, before they exited, destroyed significant amounts of business records. And they were convicted and fined $250,000 with a 10-year sentence for what was considered unauthorized damages to electronic assets. So, and Adam, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Barry. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to some of you. I want to thank all of you for attending the webinar today. I'm excited to be speaking with you. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions, we invite you to share them with us in the chat window, and Robin will make sure that we see those and we can answer them for you. In reviewing the attendee list earlier today, and thank you all for registering, I see that we have professionals from IT, InfoSec, we have paralegals, we have in-house and outside counsel, we have e-discovery people, compliance, RIM and IG, line of business, operations, and also HR people. So I guess this webinar really touches a chord across all aspects of the legal and corporate landscape. Before I begin this part of the presentation, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that none of what we are discussing today will work if legal, HR, IT, line of business, and records/governance don't work together and are not in sync with what needs to be done, whether that's from process execution to checklist management, in order to stop the leaks and reduce your exposure to data loss when someone leaves your organization. What we are discussing today holds true for organizations big or small. Smaller organizations can be hit harder when an employee leaves, as they do not typically have much in the way of technology infrastructure or support, process, or checklists. They also do not typically have a structured way to recover from data loss. In many cases, corporate data only exists in the hands of exiting employees. So if any of you are advising smaller companies, even more critical to work with them to put together a structure to deal with exiting employees. So we'll start off with some legal considerations. Barry mentioned it a little bit before in his end of the presentation. A critical factor in managing exiting employees is making sure whether they are on litigation hold. We all have an affirmative obligation to manage the data of exited employees even after they leave. So you need to have some kind of process in place so that legal, HR, and IT all know when someone leaves, and you can make sure that you've secured their information. So, some of the things you need to know is the user, does he have or she have company-issued equipment? Do they have any media that belongs to the organization or could contain customer data? Do they have any information located on personal devices, included but not limited to a cell phone or a home computer? Have they been reminded of their obligations of confidentiality as it relates to their obligations to the organization? One second, move the slide forward. Do they have any long-term client commitments, such as testimony requirements, meetings, or project-related deadlines? What data or systems are they primarily responsible? We need to know what they're responsible for so that we know that we have all of the information related to those responsibilities. You can see here password disclosure is something that is often forgotten about, and then a person leaves, and in certain cases it might be an IT person who has the keys to the kingdom, but those keys are lost when the person leaves. Having post-contact information like a mailing address, a phone number, email address available to multiple people, not just a manager, is critical so that everyone who needs to have information from that departed employee has it. Some IT considerations to think about. As I mentioned in the previous slide, IT should verify that the exiting employee is or isn't on legal hold and make sure to preserve all of their media and data in conformance with company policies. Assets and locations to be considered for preservation and protection, regardless of whether that individual is on legal hold. Cell phones and tablets. Again, if you have a BYOD policy, you need to make sure that you follow that. Collect the cell phone or a tablet if it is company policy. If it is the end user's property, make sure you follow policy to make sure that you sanitize that device when they leave the company from corporate data. Card key badges, ID badges for swiping into the building, the office, or even the parking lot, those should be secured. Work computer or laptop, making sure that you gather that early. We've seen many cases where an employee leaves and they have that device for weeks and possibly months after they leave. Then an issue comes up, and then it becomes hard to secure that device after they've left. USB and thumb drives, USB thumb drives and other external media should be collected from the individual. Accounts that the user may have, things like email accounts, Google Docs for business, access to an accounting system, FTP access, VPN access. All of those need to be considered when somebody leaves. Other resources to consider. A lot of our organizations use news and subscription services like PubMed, Law 360, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, and the like. Those accesses should be terminated because the user can use them for their own purposes at a new company on your dime if you don't turn them off. Conference bridges often get overlooked. A WebEx bridge, something like that, should be canceled for that user. Web-based file sharing resources such as Dropbox, corporate Dropbox, Box.net, OneDrive for Business, iCloud, Google Docs. There are a number of corporate provided web storage platforms that should be turned off. If we're talking about developers, you may have different code repositories out there, such as GitHub, that you would want to turn off access to. Other collaborative resources, such as Confluence, SharePoint, Documentum, or corporate wikis, you would want to turn off access to, because again, once they leave, they should not have access to critical corporate information. And then finally, there are other larger systems such as Salesforce, Goldmine, SAP, Microsoft Dynamics CRM that manage organizational workflow that should be turned off to protect your data assets. So when we talk about departing employees, again, Barry earlier mentioned that you should remind them of their obligations as an employee, and that should be done early and frankly often. But when you're sitting down with the exiting employee or departing employee, you certainly want to have them document all of their projects, make sure that knowledge is not lost as they walk out the door. They should not shred or delete documents, electronic or otherwise, without supervision or approval from a manager or the person that's taking over. They just have to remember the data is not theirs, it is yours. It belongs to the organization, and the organization should make those critical decisions, not the exiting employee. In reviewing, if you have a ticketing system, such as an IT person, or a lot of organizations have project management systems, just making sure that everything that is open to that employee is updated in the ticket or reassigned to somebody else. If there are recurring appointments, those should be canceled or transferred to other people. And you know, a lot of organizations have electronic and paper document storage requirements. A lot of people on the phone, just based on the attendee list, are in regulated industries. You have to make sure that none of that data gets lost as the employee walks out the door. So you know, it's really important to make the best of the time that the exiting employee has remaining, if that employee does remain during their transition period. Some companies, when someone gives notice, they are immediately terminated, and there is no 2-week notice period, and they may be paid out immediately on that. Other companies will allow the employee to stay for a shorter period of time until all of the information is transferred to someone else. Or, again, sometimes they may stay for that whole period, and sometimes they may be brought on as a consultant for a short time if they have a lot of things that are open that will then be transitioned to someone else. So this slide is here again on purpose. Again, everything goes back to company policy. If you have strong policy, you have good standing with employees that are exiting, and also employees that are still with you. You know, it's very important to regularly remind people of their obligations in their HR, you know, if you're talking about the HR manual or acceptable electronic use policies. It's important to update people regularly so that they are aware of their commitments and their obligations. So what should you do when someone abruptly resigns? Well, as Barry mentioned before, you need to decide if the person holds critical and sensitive information. If that person walks out the door right away and says, you know, I'm done, I'm not coming back, that could be problematic for you. For that kind of an employee who leaves, I would recommend that you not immediately repurpose their computer until you know exactly what went on with that exited employee, whether they went to a competitor, whether they went to a different industry. Once you assess what kind of risk you may have, you may decide to either forensically image that user's asset or remove the hard drive and put it on a shelf for a while to see if there is anything going on with that person who left. Replacing a hard drive is relatively cheap. It can cost you anywhere between $30 and $60. But repurposing a computer and overwriting data that you may need that you don't know that you lost could be, the cost could be immeasurable. I would also recommend that IT not browse around the computer after the user leaves. I know there's kind of, what did the person do? What did they look at? What did they access? It may be good to know that immediately, but with all good intentions, critical metadata may be trampled by that activity. So again, the recommendation is do not do any harm right away. If you need to know that information, then proceed with forensic imaging, and then you can take a look at that asset. But if you end up needing to pursue litigation against that exited employee, it just makes it harder if you've overwritten or trampled over that computer that the user used. If someone resigns with notice, again, make a determination if that person should be let go immediately. Remind them of their ongoing obligations during that period of time that they might still be working with you, let's say that 2-week period. And you may want to track their usage. As I mentioned before, work with a manager, remind them what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do, and continue monitoring that individual. You may also want to take a snapshot of their data, whether that's a forensic image or copying data to another location, just to ensure that you have what you need before that exiting employee does what we call housekeeping. If you let someone go, you should transfer information that user is working on or projects that that person is working on so that you can preserve the data as per your policies. Having an exiting employee checklists obviously are a critical thing to know what you do during the process, what assets were given to them, what data or systems that they have access to. I've seen questions before where people say, how do we make sure we're in compliance with exiting employee processes? Well, the first thing is you have to have a process. You have to know what data the user has access to, what network shares, what applications, what websites, and the like, in order to know that you have protected all of that information. It's critical to know who owns the asset, as I mentioned before, whether that be cell phones or tablets, or even laptops and desktops. Oftentimes, companies with a mobile sales force will require the salesperson to own that asset, and they work for the company on their personal asset. But if you do not have good policy in place as to who owns the information on that, and that when the employee terminates, friendly or not, they have an obligation to bring that device in immediately so that it can be remediated and have corporate collateral taken off, you're leaving yourself open to a lot of potential problems forcing and enforcing that exiting employee to hand over that device. If you don't have good policy and signature potentially or affirmation from the person that they will cooperate, we've seen employers have a hard time getting their data back. As I mentioned before, you may want to monitor the activity of the employee, whether that's daily meetings with the manager or using technology that you may have in the organization to monitor what websites they go to or what files they are accessing. As I mentioned before, don't leave it up to the employee to determine what is important. That's your obligation and your right to make that determination. Remember that your first best option to preserve data is immediately upon the notice, whether that is your notice to the employee that they're leaving or theirs to yours. We've also seen companies make severance packages contingent on the cooperation of that exiting employee. If they do a good job and they do what they're supposed to, they'll get that package. If they don't, well, then all options are open for the company to proceed to protect their assets. So what else should you do? The most critical thing you can do, obviously, is when you have notice or give notice, begin the process immediately. Do not wait. Begin executing the exiting employee process right away. Oftentimes, corporations have exiting employee on the last day that the employee is there, when they have a lunch or a cake or something for the person who's leaving, when it's with notice, something like that. But we believe that it's critical to have the first part of your exiting interview immediately upon that person giving you notice or you giving them notice, so that you can remind them of their obligations, show them that they signed the non-disclosure or in some cases a non-compete, remind them that they're not supposed to be deleting data or otherwise spoliating any potential evidence that they may have access to, and then begin working on any number of checklists that you have. Again, the legal checklist, the IT checklist, the HR checklist that you may have, and again, the employee and supervisor checklists. It's also critical that you follow up on the checklist. You need to designate who's responsible for making sure that those checklists happen and get filled out. And then once you're sure that everything is complete in those checklists and you know where all the assets are and you know what the user has access to and you know that the data has been transferred and migrated to someone else for business continuity, then you're ready to have your final exit interview, confirm that everything was done with that exited employee, and wish them well. If there's no animosity between you and the exiting employee, you should obviously thank them for their service. You have their follow-up information and ask them if anything else comes up, can we reach out to you? You never know if you need to follow up with them. So these processes can be fraught with anxiety and frustration and angst, but if we all handle them in a professional, methodical way, I think we can get past some of that uncomfortable and awkwardness. So what's next? Trust but verify. The person is left. You may not know where they went. You may not be sure what they did. So what can you do after an employee leaves? Well, you can perform a forensic investigation after you've preserved and properly preserved that user's asset, whether that's a laptop or desktop they had access to, a cell phone or tablet that they've been using. So what can we see when we do an investigation after we've imaged that person's asset? Well, we can see who's logged in. We can see login activity, whether it's just that user or other people. We can see externally plugged in media like thumb drives, flash drives, external hard drives, cell phones, iPods, or other music players. Those can also be storage devices. We can do deleted file recovery. Sometimes when a user gives notice, they already did their housekeeping to the computer. They might have deleted emails. They might have deleted files. This may give you an opportunity to recover some of that data that was deleted. We can see internet activity, where they went on the internet, what websites they visited, how often they may have visited, and also search strings, whether that be Yahoo, Bing, or Google searches. What were they looking for on the internet shortly before or even a while before they left? Wiping activities. Did they wipe data? Did they install any software that should not have been on there that they might have used to hide their tracks or clean up or optimized their computer before they left. Again, going back to electronic use policy, acceptable policy, you should have things like the user shouldn't install software that's not authorized by the company. They should not on their own install cleanup software or optimization software on their computers. Again, just for your protection, to know that what's on that computer is what is authorized and acceptable. We can see files that the user recently accessed, whether that would be on their local computer, on that desktop or laptop, or across the network. That might be important for you because the user may be accessing files that they shouldn't be. If it's a salesperson and you don't have certain controls on your network and you see they're accessing accounting or IT documents, that could be a significant red flag for you. Knowing whether they've used webmail might be important to you. They might be using personal Gmail or Hotmail or something on their computer, and there may be a possibility that they sent documents from that computer to their personal email accounts. We can often see that as part of a forensic investigation. Again, recently used documents, what they had accessed, definitely would be important in a number of investigations. You may want to pull the hard drive out for people who are in sensitive positions for later investigation. You may not suspect anything right now. You may have left amicably. The person may have left for personal reasons or whatever the reason. But again, it's a cheap insurance policy to pull out that hard drive, put it on a shelf for a couple months, 6 months, just to find out what that user is doing after that period. And then at that point you can repurpose or wipe that hard drive. Again, as I mentioned before, the cost of hard drives are relatively cheap, $30 to $60, so it's not a large expense to protect yourself for further investigations. So some real-world, we'll start some real-world examples of what we've seen, for over the years that we've been doing this. But before I start, step that you can take, some additional steps you can take to mitigate the risk of exiting employees. If you are planning on terminating an employee, you may want to offer outplacement services. Again, the more warm the termination is, the less chance there might be for an employee to want to take one-sided damaging actions against you. Can't repeat it enough times. Checklist. Having them available in all of the groups we discussed so that everyone knows what to do when it's time to execute. System administrators should have full control over users' files, whether it's in the cloud or on the network. A lot of times you may find that for certain security configurations, the only person who can get to certain documents is going to be that user. Not even the system administrator can get to it. And then the user's Active Directory or network account is deleted, and then you no longer have access to their data. So again, as part of understanding what assets the user has, understanding permissions and availability is definitely critical during the period that you're doing your exiting employee process. We often see that people end up using personal email addresses to do company work. We feel that it's very important that email addresses should always be company controlled. All company business should happen on company email servers or systems. And if a user decides to use their personal email address, again, as part of your electronic use documents that the exiting employee agrees that they will allow you to scan their personal email accounts to make sure that none of your proprietary corporate information resides on their personal email account. So let's go into real-world examples. So exiting employee of the year and maybe the decade, maybe Edward Snowden. I think we all know what he did, so we won't go too deeply in that. But again, this is a case of an employee who apparently had access far wider than he really should have. There weren't enough safeguards in place. There wasn't enough monitoring of what the employee did. And certainly there was no monitoring of what he took away from where he was working in that government facility. So some of the war stories, there are a lot of them. So we worked on a case where a developer came in on a weekend before he resigned, and he copied source code to a thumb drive. We found this out as part of the investigation, and the client made demands that the data be returned. Another case, Dropbox was used by an employee to sync data to a home computer. When they got home, they emptied the Dropbox folder. When you look at the company side folder, it's empty, so the employer thought that there was nothing in there and nothing to be concerned. But when we looked at the synchronization information, we discovered that there was actually data there, and it was emptied, and it was probably somewhere else on his home computer. And then as part of litigation, they were obligated to turn over that home computer so that we could remediate that corporate collateral from that device. For another exit employee, we saw that she searched for how to permanently delete Outlook email as part of a web search on the computer, and that obviously gave the client concern that that user was deleting not just personal information, but also corporate information, and they actually had to go back to company backups to try to recover email that was business related. Another investigation, a broker left and formed a number of brokers left and formed a competing brokerage business. When we investigated their computers, we actually found very little, which kind of surprised us. But then when we found out that the administrative assistant left, that's where we found the gold mine of information. It was actually the administrative assistant who was managing communications with these brokers who left and sending across information. A recruiter left to go to a competing recruitment company. And this was interesting. He inadvertently used the company email address to send cell phone photos of the client contact database to himself. So the client actually did some keyword searches, didn't find anything, but when we looked at images, we actually saw those cell phone photos that he had sent to himself. So again, a cell phone can be a way of, someone may not email things to themselves, but they may take pictures on a cell phone, and that could be a way that data leaks from the organization. Another case, we examined Salesforce activity on a departed employee's computer to see what they did before they left, and then we actually continued with the investigation with Salesforce to access information that otherwise was not available to us to determine that that exited employee downloaded data according to the Salesforce logs that we received to his home computer. So again, it's not just what you as the organization have. We and a lot of companies of our type have the ability to work with cloud providers to get other logs that are not available locally. So other world examples, I've got a million of them. Cha-cha-cha for those of us who are old enough to remember Jimmy Durante. I'll go through a few more. A salesperson left a company and did not return the laptop. He did return a laptop, which turned out not to be the current one that he had, and he actually wiped data from that computer. I mentioned Conference Bridge on one of the items that you should make sure that IT turns off, or whoever manages those systems. There was a salesperson who left. They did not change their Conference Bridge number, and for 6 weeks that exited employee dialed into the weekly sales meeting unbeknownst to everyone, because they had 30 or 35 people on that Conference Bridge, and he was listening to all of their sales strategy for weeks after he left. We've seen so many cases where email is not timely disabled when an employee leaves. So they'll leave with their phone. They may have access to Outlook web access, and they're still seeing things that are going on in the organization, especially if they're still on email distributions, not just on single emails to them. So I didn't mention email distributions. Again, another point that IT needs to take care of to make sure that that user is removed from those distributions. Another case was this was a car service, limousine type service, that the gentleman was basically creating the new company that he was going to run on company time. We found evidence of articles of incorporation, new office lease. We found an export of contact lists, and that he had emailed those contact lists to his personal email account. Engineer who FTP'd critical documents to competition, and the company always wondered why the competition came out with an announcement 3 days before them of a similar product. They couldn't figure that out until we discovered that they had leakage through FTP. And why was it FTP? Those documents were too large to email. They were CAD designs. So another one was sales info theft. The client sued 10 people because they stole billing rates and pay rates and client lists, and went into business against their former employer. So to wrap up this section, again, you need to remind people of their obligations, what they are supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. And Barry mentioned the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The specific individual that was fined and also potentially has to spend 10 years in jail was an IT person who went in and deleted a lot of logs and other information. From an IT perspective, I don't think that's been tested for salespeople or other standard employees. But you may also want to remind people that not only do they have an obligation, but if we do find out that they acted untoward, then the company reserves all remedies under law to protect themselves and overcome whatever problems may have been caused by that act from the exiting employee. So at this point, Robin, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Adam. That was fascinating. We do have some questions. You mentioned so much great information and things that we should be looking for. Is there a way that we can build this duty to help our respective organizations preserve their information into our culture and onboarding?
Sure. So, it's interesting. We're talking about stopping the leaks as it pertains to exiting employee, but it actually doesn't begin with exiting employees. It really should begin with onboarding. It begins with policy, technical infrastructure, checks and balances, as well as regular reminders. Organizations need to either have or try to foster, develop a culture of protecting the company's assets and knowing what that means. Worth ethics, where creating a culture of protecting assets is really part of a work ethic. And I think it's important that organizations train or remind their employees what they mean. You know, I and some other people on the call may be of a slightly older generation. We have maybe a different. I know, but we may have a different view or understanding of what work ethics are, and I think it's good for an organization to explain what that means. You know, we all shouldn't be. Well, you know, again, just have everyone being on the same level playing field, I think, is important.
And Adam, let me add one other thought, and that is to respect your employment relationship. And it goes both ways, from the employer down to the employee, but also the employee up to the employer, that there is a whole issue of trust and expectation that you respect what it is that the company is doing for you as an employee, and obviously the employer has to respect the employee base as well.
Absolutely. Adam, what is the best practice to preserve terminated employee ESI?
Well, I guess to best answer that question, we would want to understand why we're needing to preserve that information. Is it because of litigation purposes? If that's the case, then you know, you may have standard electronic discovery practices within the organization to either hold that computer's computer in storage, or take out their hard drive, or use e-discovery tools to collect data from that individual just as a wrap-up, if you will, of their employment, and put that in with the rest of the data that was collected for litigation. It may be for retention reasons. So again, you know, retention could be, you know, for records retention policy, the individual may be a keeper or custodian of those specific records. I'll use the example of corporate minutes or something like that. Again, just follow whatever that you know, IG type retention requirement is, and put that data where it belongs if it isn't already there. Or I think that the last reason could be just for general business continuity. You have a salesperson, or you have an administrator, or you have a sales scientist, or what have you. You certainly may want to transfer that user's data to the manager, so the manager can have access to all of that information, or to the employee that's going to replace that individual in those tasks or responsibilities. It may be that you may not have the right employee right now, so again, I would then defer to making sure that the manager has access to that information for you know, short-term holding until you have that continuity person in place.
Mm-hmm. This may be something you've answered, or maybe a silly question, but do you proceed differently when it's an adversarial departure as opposed to a friendly departure? I know you had mentioned those two distinctions earlier in your talk.
Barry, you want to start with this one?
Sure. There is definitely a difference in the tone of the exiting process. In an adversarial situation, you know, I mentioned the Yates memo where there could be corporate wrongdoing. There has to be, in an adversarial situation, a lot more attention to what the exiting employee may have been involved with prior to the termination, and what the plans are for that exiting employee after they leave. If it's known they're going to a competitor, if it's known that they may have committed an act that can damage the corporation, much more care needs to be taken with how to preserve and collect their electronic assets and their hard assets. As Adam mentioned, the best method in an adversarial relationship may be a forensic image of that person's electronic assets, so that subsequent to departure, those assets can be reviewed for any nefarious activity. With a friendly departure, you still need to be mindful that that person who is leaving had access to your company information. So you still want to, at time of exit interview and the initial interview, as Adam suggested, and then the final interview, make certain that you have properly secured, collected, passed on to the successor employee, if there is going to be one, that person's electronic information. And again, of course, remind in both situations the employee regarding the policies and procedures that they committed to and agreed to at the outset of their employment and throughout the pendency of their employment relationship. It's, Adam said it several times, it's the reminder, you tell them what the policies are and remind them along the way that those policies exist, and remind them at the end that those policies and obligations continue.
Yeah, Adam, we've got time for a comment from you if you've got one on this question.
Yeah, let me just finish the thought there, if you don't mind, Robin. So in an adversarial situation, you really need to be careful whether or not the nexus of potentially knowing that litigation may arise from it happens as part of that adversarial process. And it's not just about, at that point, it's not just about that exiting employee. It may be about other coworkers and managers as well. So just be mindful of that. I'm sorry, Robin, you had one last question?
No, that was it. I was going to say we had time for that one comment before we got to top of the hour. So thank you for weighing in on that. On behalf of the team at BIA, I want to just remind you, in order to get the slide deck and our checklist, please complete the short survey as you leave today. Next month, we are absolutely excited to have with us Mike Quartararo. Mike has written the definitive text on project management in e-discovery, and he'll be with us on July 21st. You can find more information in the emails you'll receive. Thanking you for attending today. There'll be a link to register for July's program. We want to thank all of you who attended today and who have come to our programs every month, and we look forward to seeing you again for the rest of the year. And most of all, would like to thank our distinguished speakers, Adam Feinberg and Barry Schwartz.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.